Okay. It's working now. So I'm going to go back. What I started to say is I don't know how many of you are writers or authors or have friends who are authors, but writing books is really, really hard. So therefore, you want to do something that's going to be meaningful and it's going to be fun to do, or at least I do. And so about 15 years ago, I wrote an article about Fiddler on the Roof when Theodore Bickel was playing it here. I don't know if you remember that or not. So I wrote the article for the LA Times, and I had a great time doing it. I liked all the people. I liked the sentiment. I liked just everything about it. And so when it came time for me to choose a book after my book on Frank Gehry, I thought, I'm going to do that Fiddler on the Roof book because that was a great book to do. So then you have to start to find all the people. You have to do all the research. The thing I did that I thought was amazing was that the New York Performing Arts Library at Lincoln Center has a Jerome Robbins division where you can go in there and you can just pull out any document you might want. And so I sat there for weeks reading Jerome Robbins's notes about the show, what he wanted to do, what his dreams were, and it was all on this yellow legal pad with lines around it and circled and stuff like that. And then I talked to Sheldon Harnick. And one person led me to the other. I'd interviewed Hal Prince many times, and so he gave me some names. And Norman Jewison gave me a lot of names. So what you need is one person who knows someone. And a friend of mine knew Norman Jewison. And then by the time I'd interviewed him a few times, he pulled out his date book and started giving me all the phone numbers. So that helped a lot.
Is there anybody that you interviewed in your book that wasn't covered in the film that may have given some story that you didn't know or that you could share with the audience?
Well, I thought I was going to tell you a little bit about the casting of Topol, because I thought that was such a really interesting story. And when Jewison, he told you how he went in and he got the assignment. And then he didn't know who to cast originally. He knew he did not want to have Zero Mostel because Zero Mostel was too big and would just fill the screen too much. So Joe Stein, the book writer, said, you know, I saw Topol perform once. Why don't you go see him? So Topol was performing Fiddler in London, and it was the last weekend, I think, or maybe a week before it ended. And so Jewison got on a plane, went there, went backstage to talk to Topol, and Topol told me that he said, who believes him? He said, it's going to be in 3 years. I said, 3 years? You're not going to remember me in 3 years. Now, that's probably all the English Topol could say at that time. And so then later on, when it became time for an audition, before the audition. So once the word got out that the movie was being made, every actor in Hollywood and on Broadway wanted that part. And if you look, I have a list in my book of all the people who wanted the part or who auditioned. And
Yeah, tell us some of them.
Oh, I'll tell you the best one, actually, is Danny Kaye. Now, but he wasn't the only one. Richard Burton wanted the part.
Frank Sinatra?
Wait,
Had
who
you
said
ever
that?
heard that?
Oh, yeah. No, that's in my book, actually. I was going to make that the punchline.
Oh,
But we'll come back.
Uh-oh.
We'll come back to the punchline. Okay?
So sorry.
Anyway, so Danny Kaye knew Jewison, and he wanted that part more than anything in the world. And he was constantly calling Jewison and saying, come for breakfast, come for lunch, we got to talk, I want to tell you about my Zeta. And so finally, Jewison and Danny Kaye got together. And then later, Jewison was thinking, he's not right, he's just not right. And so he became more interested in Topol. And Topol the whole group flew to London to meet Topol. Now, you have to remember, Topol was 30 years old when they made this film. Oh, my God. Okay? But he had been in 2 films previously. which were in Israel, where Israeli films, so he didn't have to worry too much about his English. And he got to London, and he went to the rehearsal hall where they were all going to interview him. And so he walks in, and everybody's saying, "Where's Topol? Where's Topol?" And finally he had to say, "Here, I'm here," because he would just come back from his reserve duty in Israel. He had a suntan. He was 30 years old, you know. So then I'm going on too long. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I think that people are interested in hearing the stories that we don't know.
Okay, but I forgot to mention Frank Sinatra after that. When Jewison came back from lunch with Danny Kaye, he called his agent. He said, "I don't know what I'm going to do. I can't find anyone to do this part." And the agent said, "Well," he said, "I have a call here from Frank Sinatra. Will you go to Palm Springs and meet with him?" And Jewison said, "No." No. And then it became urgent. And that's when, you know, the Topol kind of developed. So.
That's a great story. Now, I can't remember because I came in late to the film, if it was in the film or if it was in your book. But there was one point talking about that Zero Mostel, yes, you said that he was too big for the screen. Yeah. And also that the way he portrayed it, I have to admit that I saw him when I was 8 at the Westbury Music Fair in New York, and he was a friend of my uncle's, and I met him. That had a big impact on me. So, and I played the album every single day for years. But Zero Mostel was definitely a very big character. Also, he was a humorous guy, so he brought, you know, a certain something else to the part. There was, I don't remember if it was in your book or in the film where they talked about Topol being an Israeli, and
Right.
Was it in the film? Okay.
Yeah, it was in the book too. Yeah.
Okay, so then I'm hitting both.
Yeah, and he was actually fun to interview. When I first called him, and I told him I wanted to talk to him about Fiddler on the Roof, and I said, you know, "Are you free now?" He said, "No, I'm not free." He said, "I'm watching a basketball game." Okay. But then he gave me as much time as I needed, you know, and he was great. So, yeah. Yeah, he looks probably like he does in that film.
Yeah, he does.
Yeah.
Now,
So-
I had heard about Zero Mostel that Hal Prince, you know, that because Zero was such a big, larger-than-life character, that as the play went on, he started kind of adding bits, and that Hal Prince had decided that it was time for him to kind of move on, and they should have like the regional, you know, or different casts, that it shouldn't just be the Zero Mostel show. So that certainly led to the casting issue, I guess, for the film. But also that I guess one time he was watching the play, and Zero was dunking his sleeve into the milk cans, and then he went and kind of, you know, wrung it out over the orchestra pit, and so Hal Prince decided, you know, that was enough. I had a question though about kind of because they kind of touched on it a little bit, but they conflated some of it. That relationship is between Zero and Jerome Robbins,
Oh, yeah.
But hadn't that really come up earlier before that with Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum? Because
Yeah.
Barbara talks about that in her book.
so could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, they had worked together on A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. And then when this show came about, I think it was, I can't remember actually which of the two shows it was, if it was Fiddler or Forum. But the first day of rehearsal, when Robbins and Mostel were going to meet for the first time on the show, everybody in the cast was standing around utterly silent, waiting to see what would happen. And so Mostel comes in and he walks over to Robbins and he goes, "Hiya, loose lips."
Yeah.
And that was the beginning, but also, I tell you one other thing. I interviewed Zero's nephew, who told me a lot about what Zero, because Zero Mostel had died by the time I started the book, and he told me all these stories about how that animosity represented itself. And he said once, Harold Robbins, sorry, Jerry Robbins was sitting at lunch, and Zero Mostel was sitting at lunch, and Jerry Robbins comes in, and he's sitting at lunch, and Mostel gets up, puts his hands on Robbins' shoulder, and Robbins was not a very big man, and pushed really hard, and Robbins couldn't do anything because he needed Mostel. And I mean, there were little things like that. They did have a lot of animosity, but they both loved the show. And so they put it aside as much as they could.
But the film didn't really get into it so much, but Mostel really was victimized by the HUAC hearings and didn't work, and his career was really stopped, and so it was really personal for him, and it was very difficult for him as his friends. Yeah.
And his best friend that lost everything. Well, he lost everything too. But the other one was named, I can't remember who it was right now, was named by Jerry Robbins.
So actually, I'm going to put this to Steve, because we're talking about, what was going on at the time in the world. So you and I talked a little bit about the importance of the timing when Fiddler came out, September 22nd, 1964, and the lead up to that. What was going on in America? America was questioning tradition and change was taking place. So let's talk about that.
So I think that this came at such an important moment. You saw a depiction of the women's movement, but it was also the time of Black is Beautiful. You saw also the Chicano activists here in Los Angeles. There was the beginning of the gay rights movement in 1968. Or the beginning in New York. It had actually started here earlier in Los Angeles, but all of these movements were kind of swirling around, and it was also a time, I think, of transition for the American Jewish community, and I think the film didn't focus on it so much, but I think there were three big events really that happened in the Jewish community at the time. Sandy Koufax's refusing to play on Yom Kippur, which had happened earlier than that. Fiddler on the Roof, which transformed what many Jews had felt very embarrassed about their immigrant origins, and they changed their names, they changed their noses. Suddenly, Fiddler was really presenting a different image and was taking those stories and making them universal. But it's also, I think what's remarkable about it is so Jewish. So it doesn't shy away from being Jewish. It is proudly in-your-face Jewish, and that was a departure. And I think it paved the way, 4 years later for like Funny Girl. I think Barbra Streisand could do what Barbra Streisand did because Fiddler did what it did. And I think we don't give it as much credit. I remember I growing up, I was 8 years old, I think, and my parents came home. My mom is here in the audience, actually, Pearl. My parents came home, and each year in our synagogue, our cantor did a concert for Shabbat Shira, for each year when you read the Torah portion about the singing, and so there would be a congregational concert. And Baruch Cohen, very gifted cantor still, and rabbi still alive in his 90s. And my parents came home that night, and they were singing the songs from Fiddler, and they went out the next day, and they bought, we still have it, a tattered Joseph Stein's book, and it had the Boris Aronson poster on the front, and then they bought the cast album, and similar to you, we listened all the time. And I think going to camp, Sabbath prayer became as much a part of the Friday night service as the the traditional prayers. And, you know, how many of us at the time went to a wedding and Sunrise Sunset was played as you know, part of the processional music, or, you know, under the chuppah. And so it became kind of the folk religion of American Jewry. And this is told from a very New York perspective, but I will tell you, growing up as a kid here in Los Angeles, that Fiddler, I really think, had an enormous impact. And Herschel Bernardi played here, and Luther Adler played here, and you know, we awaited it. We were so excited to have it come.
That's interesting, because I had the experience of the East Coast. And it did feel like a very personal New York Jewish thing, even as a small child. So I wanted to put this question to both of you. What do you think made Fiddler such a cultural phenomenon, number one? And how did it bring Jewish life, customs, traditions to the forefront in the general public? And how did that make Jews feel?
That's fine. That's okay. I think what it did was, well, first of all, the actual script for Fiddler on the Roof is dedicated to our fathers. All three of the writers were first-generation Americans. So you already had that going in. And you had the sentiment of these three people who never thought it would be a big musical. They never, it was work. They just had work. They had trouble selling it, but okay, they would do this musical. And I think that Bach told me in his own words, we just figured we'd finish this one, we'd go right on to the next one. You know, they didn't see it as that big a deal. But as it started to roll, you know, as they started to see things, and even in Detroit, where the show was 4 hours long, and they at midnight, people all started to leave, but they walked out backwards. And they wanted to not miss one more thing. And I think that, the other thing I wanted to tell you is that they said it so well in the film, a lot of these things, about how this is a story that is going on every day. And I think it shows that it's going on every day for the Jews as well. Yeah. And I interviewed one director who told me that when he would direct a show of Fiddler, he would tell his actors, go home, turn on the television, and look at what's going on in the Middle East right now. It hasn't changed. You know, the feelings haven't changed. So.
I think, you know, there's a folk saying, which is that Jews are just like everyone else, only more so. And I think Fiddler so taps into that. So it's particularistic, and yet it's universal, because all of those elements of, you know, tension between tradition and change, and modernity coming on, and how that conflict and the issues of relationships in a family and relationships in the larger community. I think because it's so, you know, whether it was witting on their part or unwitting, but I mean, they so were able to bring their, I don't know, their abilities in the theater and bring them to bear on the stories and make them come to life. And I think also they're, from what I understand about, you know, their own Jewishness, so like Zero Mastel, he came from that world of the shtetl. I mean, he really knew that world, and he broke from it. His father wanted him to be a rabbi, I believe, and he broke from it. Robbins was a more Americanized, but it was a conflict. But he was from that too. But then he had issues in ambivalence as well, but he ultimately was he wanted to do right by it. I think he wanted to make some peace with it, and so I think that the show became so successful because it tapped into that, but it also, the stories are everyone's stories, and the headlines still, I mean, sadly, when we see the refugees and we see, you know, young people holding, you know, torches, and how it's it's in the film, and that perhaps it said that Robbins was influenced by the Ku Klux Klan and kind of the way that they terrorized African Americans, but to see it in our time, and that's news footage from this year, last year, and that we're still doing this. It's an age-old story, and I think all of us relate
Makes
to
it still relevant after all
Yeah,
these
sadly
years.
in that way, but yes, yes.
I want to,
Yeah, go
excuse me,
ahead.
before we drop it, I just want to add one more thing about Jerome Robbins that I thought of when you said that, which is that he was never really a serious Jew. He wasn't. But when he was a little boy, his parents took him back to where his grandparents grew up. But he sang songs with his grandfather. That was in the movie?
No, that's in your
No,
book.
okay. So, yeah, that's it. No, someone said it was in the movie. Anyway, so when he came back and he was having this conversation with Austin Pendleton, who, as you could see, was a great talker. He was wonderful. And he said to Austin, he said, I want to bring that world back. I want to show everybody what it was like for another 25 years. And what Austin said was, it's been a lot more than 25 years. But that was his dream. I think it was just tapped later on.
Yeah. I just have one more quick question before we open it up to the audience. And, okay, we have about 10 minutes. Has this film, the play, Fiddler, been banned anywhere in the world?
I'm sure it has, but I don't know where.
I mean,
You
we
know,
see
it's-
all the places that it's had an impact. Japan, Thailand. I have a friend who saw it when she was a child in Nairobi. So,
Well, it's,
yeah.
there are, it's usually playing in Europe in at least 10 cities at any time. But it is also playing in Africa and South America. I just don't know where it might have been banned.
Yeah.
If it has been, maybe it never has been.
Yeah, I'm sure the Middle East.
Well, I don't know. It's played, well, I don't know. Sorry.
Did it play in the Soviet Union during the time of
It has-
oppression? No, like during
back then.
when Jews were being oppressed and that. I would think Tevye's stories would have, but because it
I
was
don't know.
anti-czarist, so in that way the communists might have liked it. I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, it has played in Russia the last few years. I know that.
All right, let's take a few questions. Okay, we're going to start with the gentleman up there. And if you could stand up and say your question so we could all hear it, please.